it on this computer, share screen. Okay, so the Hypershade. Your best friends are the materials that you can create with the Hypershades, right? So if you right now, but up here you have everything you need, right? From textures, and you see what I don't like is right now, sorry, I had left over that texture that I wasn't too happy with. So what I was trying to show you is that you can create all kind of material and all kind of textures. So, and by the way, here, I also want to show you that here you have your materials. So this interface is very dense because it shows you up here the materials that you have currently in your interface. It also shows you the texture you have currently in the interface. It shows you the lights that you have in it. It shows you the cameras. You recognize these, right? Those are the default cameras of our viewports, the front, the perspective, the side, and the top. So it shows you a whole lot of, elements in this interface. And that's kind of what is already there. Down here, it allows you to add material. So you can say, hey, look, I want to add in my material. Right now I have a Lambert. That is the default Maya material, by the way. I'm going to add a Fong. So now I have this Fong that by default is called Fong 2, because earlier I created a Fong that was defaulted Fong 1. And now that I have this Fong selected, you can decide if you want to give it a color. So this side is the equivalent of what you call the attribute editor in Maya. Do you remember when we wanted to change an attribute of an object? You could go in this attribute editor where you could like choose all kind of edit, all kind of settings of that object, of kind of properties of that object. This is kind of the same thing, but this time you're editing the properties of whatever material you have selected. So you can go in there and say, I'm going to choose a color. And last time I did a pink, I'm going to do a beautiful kind of like more like an orange color. And you can slide things around and decide how bright or not you want. Yeah, I love this orange yellow. Look how it looks kind of yellow here and more orange there. So you can decide you want to give it a color. You can decide that you want to give it transparency. You guys see what happens there when I try to add transparency to it. You can decide that you want to give it an ambient color. Now I'm going to change this ambient color because it shows you what a dramatic difference it makes. By default is black. So what if I go in here and say, I want actually my ambient color to be more like a reddish color. You guys see the difference? It's dramatic, isn't it? It means that ambient color makes a world of difference. You guys remember this was a fairly kind of mellow orange. Now it's like a ball of fire, right? Because I changed the ambient color to this insane color. Let's be colorful today. And then you can give it incandescence to it. You see what's happening when I change the incandescence? It has this kind of like effect, like it's emanating light. And then you have this diffuse option that also kind of has to do with if you scroll through, you see that if you take the diffuse away, it kind of has much less emanating and reflective as if you have the diffuse there. The default diffuse is 0.8. I do like the diffuse, to be honest. I've used it a lot in my characters. Sometimes I love to add this kind of diffuse this kind of emanating light of the material, obviously. So what if you wanted, though, you say, okay, I like all that, but I want to give it more like a 3D effect. Like this is going to be a stucco material for a building. So instead of fussing with the colors, you could keep doing, oh, by the way, here you have another bunch of options. We'll talk more about shadows and stuff in next class. But here you can also give it a specular color. What we were saying earlier, we were explaining earlier how you can paint these black and white maps that you assign to the character so that the white will be kind of protruding and the black will be recessing or recessed. And that's definitely where you would want to browse to that map, right? Versus we learned in the past lecture that if we wanted to give color to my character, you would go under color here, click on the little checker, and browse, and choose PSD and then browse to a file, right? PSD file right there. I want to show you that if you want to assign a bump map, you do the same thing. You click on here, and then you would choose PSD and browse to that black and white map you painted. But let's go back to the color and show you how you can give it more like a stucco effect. So pay attention to the fact that right now we have this Fong E highlighted in my Hypershade, right? So clearly we're working with the Fong E. We're making changes of the interface of the Fong E. You see up here it says, sorry, I said Fong E. I meant to say Fong 2. I apologize. Up here says Font 2, right? So that means whatever we do right below it, all these properties are going to go to affect this material. So I'm going to click on my little options. And right here, instead of PSD file, as I said, you can choose whatever you want. You can say, I'm going to make it look like a leather, or make it look like a cloth, or I'm going to make a checker effect, or I'm going to make a fluid effect. You basically, I don't say the sky's the limit, but there's a whole lot you can do. Let's go with marble. As I say, I like stucco, rock, and marble because the three-dimensionality is more evident. Do you guys want marble, stucco, or rock?
Marble.
All right, let's go with marble. Right here. There it is. So we got marble. Now, Maya obviously has to have a default. And the default for marble, is red and white. And I'm never really too crazy about this stark white. Now, notice that we lost the color we had picked before, right? Before we had picked that orange for my material. In the minute in which you go into marble or stucco or cloth, Maya assigned its own default depending on the material you chose. So what you want to do here is I generally change the color because I never really find the Maya choice to be the most, I try to go with a much more subtle transition so that there isn't so much, like a stark. But it's up to you, obviously. And as I said, here you can kind of play with it. It's nice that it shows you the preview, so you decide how stark you want to be. Right here, you might say, look, I want that to be more like a blue color right there, something like that. Maybe those are the two colors you choose, a kind of gray violet color and a blue, and you're maybe happy with it. Also, you can say, I want more or less veins. You can see here, you can choose the veins that you want to have there. And, again, you can choose if you want to have diffusion and the contrast, if you want to bump it up. You can see that I don't like too much contrast generally in the marble, so I generally take it down. You can see that it looks a little bit more soothing without it. You can add noise, you can finagle with the color balance, you can do whatever you want. Now, everything that we're changing on this side, we could be changing in the nodes. This is kind of the same view that you see here in a more elaborate and visual way, because like I told you earlier, all of these can be opened up and kind of manipulated. I'm actually generally not at the first class asking you guys to play with that node view because it's very powerful, but you can mess things up because look how dense already we are. And we have just one basic material. We haven't done anything fancy. And look at my nodes and how much is there. So how do I assign it? You guys probably remember, I'm going to put the Hypershade to the side. Oops. Sorry, I still have this one open. Oh, no, I didn't say okay. Shoot. My fault. That's all right. Let's go back. How did I mess it up? No, I thought I did. This one, I said okay, but I did not say okay to the bluish color. I don't know if it matters really, guys, for you. What I wanted to show you is how do I get to assign it. So if I go in here, I'm going to actually minimize the Hypershade. And I'm going to go in here and create, look, notice what happened. Actually, I did this on purpose. This means we have a 3D texture on our scene. So at the moment, we don't even have a material, but Maya is acknowledging, is telling us, you just created, that marble was a 3D texture. You just created a 3D textures in your scene. So if we go in and create anything like, this, and I'm going to actually scale it a little bit bigger. Oop, sorry. All right, let me do this. Wait, what's going on? It's not letting me move this thing. That's really weird. I have an idea. Sorry, you always have to kind of be resourceful. It's because it was somehow, gosh, I have it. My mouse is maybe problematic. You see, it does not allow me to do anything right now. Oh, that is so interesting. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, I can use the right mouse button, but my left mouse button is actually somehow defective. That's exciting. That's how it goes. So I'm going to go back into my Hypershade. Sometimes you have to deal with the fact that you have to reset maybe your mouse or whatever you need. But before I do that, since we're in the middle of a video, so if you want to assign this material, you want to middle mouse click and drag. You kind of know that by now. And if you don't see a whole lot of a change, remember, if you are in 5 or 4, 4 is wireframe, 5 is shaded, 6 is allows you to see the material. So you want to be in 6, honestly, to see what you just assigned. And you can see if my mouse worked. Gosh, it doesn't allow me to even deselect right now. That's very strange. I hit Q to get rid of the manipulator, but you can see, I'm sorry about my mouse. I need to figure out a way to make it work. You know what? I'm going to actually unplug it. And that should make it a little bit easier. Yeah. So yeah, it's my mouse because the trackpad works just fine. So you can see this. I mean, it's not the best marble in the world, but you know, it could be the marble. So what I wanted to show you though is this idea that whenever you select this and you go in the attribute editor that is down here, you will see that you have different tabs now. And the tabs are, okay, you have a sphere called sphere 1. The sphere has a certain shape. And all of these you can open and change, by the way. I don't want to necessarily go in each of them because it's going to take us forever. For now, I just want to give you the overall perception of what's available for you in the attribute editor to change. If you need to edit this material or edit this shape or edit anything about this sphere, you can obviously go in here and change, you know, whatever is under the polysphere, so that the fact that it's a polygon, so you can change. You've seen that through the channel box in the past, in which we can change the subdivisions to make it more or less refined and things like that. So this is more the tab that pertains to the geometry itself, to the polygon. And then here we are. We can go back into the Phong too, so we can obviously edit it through the Hypershade, or we can, that includes the attribute editor. Sorry, I want to move it up, but there is so much in my screen. So you can see that these are very, very similar, right? So remember, you can get back to the Hypershade, or once you assign that material, you can go into that material selected and then go into that Phong and see everything that has to do with your material right there. So be aware also that if you actually try to replug in my mouse, if you actually, let me see if I can zoom out in, and I love to use the middle mouse button to zoom. If you actually see this little box in your scene, it's not something you need to delete, but it's an indication that you have a 3D textures in your scene. So that's kind of one way to create a material. Thank you. So how do I edit? How do I render the scene? Now, pay attention. I have absolutely no lights in my scene at the moment. Still, if I go under this little box right here and I click, that renders the current frame. Oh, no, sorry. The default is Maya software. I apologize. I was fussing with Arnold earlier trying to see a batch render of it. Sorry, the default is Maya software. And as you can see, it does make a rendering of your sphere, obviously based on the location of your camera, how far away from it you are. You have other options though. You have Maya hardware, and let me re-click it so you see the difference. Sorry, did I click it? Sorry, I did not. I said let me re-click it, but I didn't. You can see that the difference is, the colors are less intense. I think that the software is a tiny bit better. Or you have Maya Vector that is actually ideal to create some really strange effect. Generally, Maya Vector is basically, let's say you have an animation that you created that is all beautiful, smooth color, but you want to make it cartoonish. You want to make it like it's a graphic novel with shaded, almost like solid fillings. So the Maya Vector kind of transforms completely your work, your 3D work, makes it kind of more two-dimensional. And then you have you have Arnold renderer. And let me show you the Arnold renderer because it's quite interesting. It's a black window. Why is it black? Because if Maya hardware, software, and vector by default have a light, so just like Maya gives you a default material. You remember that every time you create something in Maya is that gray color. And if you go in the Hypershade, you'll see that there is a Lambert that is sitting there for you. Maya also gives you by default what they call an ambient light. And that ambient light is a lifesaver because whenever you render, something shows up. Arnold does not do that. Arnold does not provide for you a light. So if you wanted to render in Arnold, you would want to start adding to the scene a bunch of lighting. So you can go, it's under the rendering tab. By the way, I have an Arnold tab and an Arnold menu right here because I turned Arnold on. You might not. So let me show you how you do it. You want to go under Window, UI element, no, it's called Plugin Manager. Window, Setting and Preferences, Plugin Manager. I always have to remember what it is because I don't go there all the time. Because once you turn on the plugins you need, that's generally it. So there's one called M2A, that is Maya to Arnold. So you want to scroll down. There it is, M2A. Now in my case, it's loaded and it's auto load. What's the difference? Auto load means every time I launch Maya, it's going to be there for me. Versus loaded implies that in that file is loaded. So I encourage you to check those two, or you're not going to have Arnold available. So that's the first thing to know. And then the other thing to know is that you would want to, I want to show you something really interesting in the Arnold tab. So Arnold has its own lights. So even though Maya provides lights, and I'll show you how you can use either. If you use the Maya light, the standard light, you simply want to bump up the intensity really a lot. If you just leave the intensity to the default one, Arnold generally doesn't do a whole lot. To certain light, it responds better than others. Means if you have a directional light and you render an Arnold, tend to show it to you more than if you have like a point light. We're going to talk in a minute about all those lights. And then, so your option is you can use the Arnold lights by simply going in the Arnold tab and clicking whatever you want. Or you can go in the rendering tab. Where is it? Right here. And these are the Maya default light. One is the ambient light, one is the directional light, one is the point light, one is the spotlight, one is the area light, then you have the volume light. You know, you have a whole lot. If you forget the tabs, anything in Maya, you can go under create, and just like you can create NURBS, you can create polygons, you create volume, you can create lights. And we'll obviously go into creating cameras. So right here, there are the lights I was telling you: ambient, directional, point, spot, areas, and volume. So, and I'm going to tell you each what they are. I'm going to actually look. I generally use the tabs. I never go up to the menu, so I'm going to use the tab. But what these are, so the area light is really the easiest thing you can imagine, because it's, if you're in an indoor, imagine a chandelier. If you're an outdoor, is the sun, pretty much, right? Is a big light up in the, you know, heights that is kind of shining on everything. The directional light is really, really smart because it's a light that tends to shine in one spot. Now, you guys might have heard about this thing called the 3 light rigs. And the 3 light rigs are all based on the principle that whenever you want to light, for example, a face or a person, you know, when you have one main character that you want to light at the best, one technique, I mean, there are many, obviously. There is a dome light you can make, you can do all kind of, but one way to go is also create 3 lights. An ambient light that just floods the person with light, a directional light that shows, like, you know, there is, you know, light, like there's a window. So that ambient light is just the chandelier. But in that same room, there's a window like coming in. Like if you guys see this side of my face is lit more than the other because there is a window on that side. I'm actually right, you don't see it, but right in front of me, there's a window that shines light on me. That's a directional light, you know, the equivalent. And then you want to have kind of something that will counterbalance that directional light, because oftentimes one directional light and an ambient only tends to create that the directional light creates much a harsher lighting on one side only. So you get what you would call something that looks overexposed on one side. So you would want to put a third light on the other side. Oftentimes it could be a spotlight, it could be a point light. Either way, you can obviously finagle with the intensity of these lights to obtain the maximum result. I do have some really cool videos on cameras on how to light. In one of the videos, beautifully, because it's the David of Michelangelo. So keep in mind that you have these options. Now, so what are the differences? As I said, area light, the sun or the chandelier, the spotlight, sorry, the directional light is there's a light coming from one particular direction. A point light is, I don't know if you remember, what's the name in English of, they're called lucciola in Italian, fireflies. So the point light is like fireflies, right? It's this like little dot that emanates light. Now, obviously fireflies are very subtle, The point light could be really, really bright. It depends from the intensity you assign to it. Spotlights. All of us have gone to a museum or an art gallery where there were spotlights on a painting. That's a spotlight, very controllable. In fact, the spotlight you control in two ways. You know, if all the other lights I mentioned so far, when I selected the manipulator, there's just one manipulator for that. For the ambient, the directional, and the point light, there's only one manipulator. When we get to the spotlight, you have two manipulators, one for the light, one for the aim, right? Because you want to control where is that spotlight looking at. And then this is the area light, and it's the equivalent actually of a window, right? You know, when I was telling you earlier that part of my face is illuminated, you know, it could be like a directional light. Directional light and that window is similar. I think the directional light is more intense, is more kind of like really pointed, versus the area light tend to be more suffused. And then obviously we have a 3D light. Imagine like when you go, I don't know if you've ever gone in garages in which they have these boxes or neon boxes. That's kind of the equivalent of a 3D light, is a box or a kind of rectangular three-dimensional element that emanates light. So those are the lights that you have. One other thing I want to tell you before I go anywhere, since we were talking about overall, you know, concepts. Earlier, I clicked on this button to get a renderer, but right here, this little tool, this little fellow here, is where you generally want to set up before you hit that render button. That means it's called render settings. So you generally want to click on that, and that will bring up this interface. And the reason why is because it's kind of nice that you already ahead of time, especially when you're doing batch rendering. So let's say you have your animation done and it's 1200 frames. Before you launch the batch renderer, you definitely want to go in here. Because you can do occasionally these, you can click on this button to do occasionally these quick one image tests. But ultimately what you want to do is go into the render settings and make sure that everything is really well thought out. The render will start with all the settings that you truly chose. You will be surprised how often has happened that the students would tell me, you won't believe it, I render, it took like 5 hours, but all I could see was one static image. And the reason why is because they had added camera in the rendering, in the Maya document. But when it was time to render, they never went in here to specify that they wanted to render through that specific camera. So what it did is by default, it renders through the perspective default camera that maybe is looking at a wall, at a blank wall. So they kind of had 3 minutes of rendering of a blank wall. You know what I mean? That is really important when you go in here that you know what you're doing. So let's look really quickly. Now, depending on the rendering engine that you decide, it will have a different effect. So this one is hinging on the software. Then there's a hardware, vector, and Arnold. They all will have different tabs. Arnold obviously is the most complicated. Look how many tabs it has. It has 5 tabs, right? Versus if you go in the other ones, the software, the hardware I think is also a bit intense. Not too bad. There's only 2 tabs. But bottom line, whatever you chose, let's like kind of go through at least the default. So what can you choose? What is the file output? For example, do you want a PNG? Or do you want to create a movie and make an AVI? Or try to avoid the IFF Maya unless you know you want to manipulate everything in After Effects later on. So what I would choose, you have different options, but you could choose TIFF, you can choose Targa, you can choose if you wanted to, even though I'm always worried, depending on how powerful is your computer, you could choose QuickTime. The problem with the QuickTime is I always recommend to students, if you have like 5,000 frames, don't launch the QuickTime for the whole 5,000. Do a QuickTime for 500, another one for from 0 to 500, another one from 501 to 1,000. My point is, have 4 or 5 different ones, and then you assemble in Premiere. That is really easy to do, versus risking that you launch the rendering for the whole shebang, and then it crashes in the middle and you lost it all. So if you wanted to go to be brave, because you have a strong computer and render as a movie, just be smart. Like if you go in movie right now, you'll see that somewhere it will allow you to specify the start frame and the end frame. So you really need to if I was you, I would set it up, say, okay, I'm going to render, if it's 2,000 frames, I'm going to have 4 little movies of 500 frames each or something like that. Here's what I was telling you earlier that is crucially important is which camera are you rendering? Most of the time, you will not use the perspective. Most of the time, you will have your own camera at a certain point. and it's called camera 1 or whatever it's called, and we'll go into camera, not next week, the following week. Next week is all about rigging. But bottom line is really be aware of which camera you want to use. In this case, it doesn't give me much options because I did not create a camera. If I had a camera that I made myself called camera 1, it would be there. It would be one of the options. Here has to do with the format that you want. And it really depends what the goal is. If you want to go, for example, if you want to add it on YouTube and you want something small, like full to 1024, or if you want something that you know is going to end up on a movie screen. So depending on what you want to achieve there, and I will give you guidance, by the way, when it's time to render your animation. We're actually going to aim for YouTube, to be honest, or for some video platform. And so I'll give you all the guidance for that. And then I always look into render options to see if there is, like, this is really important. You know, let's say I use the default light. The Maya ambient light is one of the light that it really matters in my work. You really need to verify that that is checked. That is checked. Maya software, you go in. This is common, so it's the same for all of the rendering engine. This one is the one related to Maya software. And obviously, you probably don't want low quality. Unfortunately, it's the default. Sadly, you see a lot of poor renderings out there because people haven't really thought about going in render settings and checking, you know, instead of, I mean, you might not want highest quality, but I would definitely go for at least high, right? And then you can decide. We will talk about shading and shadows, guys, so don't worry. But I would always go in ray tracing and check that ray tracing as well. When we talk about shadows, you'll understand why. We will use ray tracing. There are shadows that can be ray traced and others are not, but ray tracing is a really big, important one. So if you know you have ray tracing, you definitely want to have it there. And then if you know that you need motion blur because your scene has a motorcycle running through, obviously check motion blur. So you just have to patiently go through every option here and make sure that you're thinking it through. For example, if you want to have this environmental fog, you can actually create a material that creates kind of this fogginess. Let's say you're doing a scene in which there is a kind of like an evening cemetery and it has that kind of fogginess to it that makes it creepy. That's one way to reach that. So you kind of want to look through all of it and decide what do you need and what is really important. That's the software. The hardware, I'm going to actually skip comments because they're common. Oh wait, I went to vector. I wanted to go to hardware. Hardware is a little bit different, but not much. There it is. I haven't done much hardware. I try to do software, or as I said, I use a different software to do my renderings. Here, definitely you want to have anti-aliasing checked. You would want to have motion blur if you need it. You can see that it doesn't have the ray tracing option. That is why I haven't used hardware that much, because I love shadows and I oftentimes have ray tracing. And then you have Arnold, in which you have to kind of go through all of these. As I said, is the most intense, and there is. I never remember all the settings because I haven't rendered in Arnold that much. So I generally go and I have a book basically that tells you all the setting, what they mean and not. And so when we get to that point, I'll be happy to give you a handout to scan some of that and put it into a PDF format. But yeah, so the rendering settings are pretty dense and but once you get those right, you're in good shape. Does anybody have any questions? I've been blabbing for a long time and I realize it's important to see if you have any questions.
This material we created is 3D, but how is it different from, like, if we had drawn it in 2D in Photoshop and put it in? Because like right now, to me, it looks the same as if we had drawn it, like with the UV mapping.
Yeah, so because we don't have lighting, because we don't have shadows, because we don't have anything in the scene yet. That means in the minute in which you add lighting, you determine the shading, the reflectivity, all that, then everything comes to life. Means at the moment we haven't really. In fact, what we should do in this class, I'm trying to think about it, is just take one of the lecture and together take, let's say, even just the table and that bowl that we did at the beginning and give it everything we can give, means make the lighting, just right, and make it maybe in Arnold and then save as and make it without, means the lights, we could use these, but we could also use the Arnold lights And let's say we decide we use the ambient and a spotlight and a directional for using the Arnold and using the regular lights. And we do two files, one with the Arnold lights, one with the regular light, and render both and see which one, goes further. Obviously, though, we need to set up all the shadows into this, because otherwise, nothing has life when you have no shadow, no reflection, no refraction. It means right now is really as bare bone as it gets, and that's why you see it so flat. Good question. Yeah.
I think
I always tell
another
my student, doesn't matter how many hours you spend in making your model, unless the lighting is right, the rendering is right, it's just going to look not worth all those hours. So this phase of Maya of this class is really important. It means we'll make sure that we get the right. There's a lot of resources on Canvas. Yes, Walker.
I was just going to say another interesting part is if you move it around, it's like the texture is in the world, and then like, I don't know how to describe it, but if you move the object around or the box that the texture is tied to, it'll change the texture.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly. I was going to, problem is my mouse was really bad. Yeah, there it is. Thank you. Earlier, my mouse was somehow stuck, but I unplugged it and replugged it and it worked. This is it. And it's because it's basically dependent on that 3D box that was down here. But yeah, you can obviously also do this and kind of change it, or you can actually nail it down. And I'll show you how to do that too. Another thing that I forgot to tell you, I had a second of, oh, there it is, specular color. Also remember, we have to really be smart about reflection, the specularity of the material. It means whatever you assign to that material, it all matters. In fact, let me show you what I posted on Canvas so you can see it. Let's see if I get to the right place. It is. So if you go in this week, so there is an overall description of the Hypershade. It talks about the nodes and talks about everything that I talked about today. Now, this was an amazing speaker. His name is Danny Alvarez, that graduated quite a few years ago now. And he came to my class once, and he did these really spectacular lectures in which he truly explained what does it mean specularity, what does it mean iridescence, what does it mean diffuse, what does it mean. Basically, he went in and didn't tell you how necessary to do it in Maya, but more what matters most when you're building material. What do you really, because all that he mentions in these two lectures is actually reflected in Maya. You find all those pieces there. So that's why I posted here, because I really highly encourage you to see it. This is very nicely done. Arnold basics, it tells you how everything renders black unless you assign lights, which lights works best. Render tutorial. So this is just Arnold. It doesn't necessarily tell you how to render in Arnold. It's more about how does Arnold works versus this is how do I render in Arnold. This is the one about lighting the David and how important it is to do it right. And this is an older tutorial and it's about doing an interior room. But I always really liked this tutorial because it seemed to be very clear. It's 2017. Now, for anybody who cares to know, Arnold was first in Maya in 2017. So all the prior one used other like Mental Ray and V-Ray and RenderMan and other options. Here is where there's your robot tutorial that also guide you closely through making everything in terms of lighting work and rendering work. And here is again Danny Alvarez, material and texture. Sorry, I posted this a long time ago. I forget if I ever linked it correctly though.
And so I only started this the beginning of my sophomore year. At the end of my sophomore year, at the end of my sophomore year,
so he explains pretty much when he was in Cal Poly how he got very passionate of 3D modeling and learned everything about it. So this is kind of Danny's presentation. I need to check if these are different because he came multiple times. And then he gave us a bunch of really resources out there on how to make textures, how to make terrains and height maps. Down here, he talked about Blender, and these are just stuff you can download. Substance Painter, this is a Substance Painter tutorial that I was telling you about. They're actually great fun. So anyway, he just brought in some resources. Now you notice they're underneath this line because they're optional. You don't have to look at them. They're just, I think that listening to his lecture would be really useful. But, as I said, it's this Zoom quarter, so I understand that some of you might not want to look at everything or have time to look at everything. Here I also added a really old tutorial on how to do the UV unwrapping for a face, but I thought it was really very well done. It's 2015. So sometimes if I find tutorials in the past that I know were really excellent, I carry them into, you know, the later versions, knowing that there's always something that a lot of that tutorial that you can, you know, find in the new Maya. It might be in different spots. I'm going to stop the sharing and ask for question and make a plan for the future.